The grocery store was the last place she wanted to be. The day had been long, the kind of long that seeps into your bones and makes them feel heavy. She pushed the worn-out shopping cart with one hand, its front wheel wobbling and squeaking with a tired, complaining sound. With her other hand, she held tightly to her little girl's small fingers. The little girl, just 5 years old, trotted alongside, her bright eyes taking in everything. The store was almost empty. It was that quiet hour late on a Tuesday night when most people were already home. The bright fluorescent lights above hummed a lonely tune, making the white floors look almost blue. It felt like the whole world had gone to sleep, leaving just the two of them awake under the harsh, buzzing glow. She guided the cart towards the checkout lanes. Inside it were the few items she had carefully counted and calculated. A small bag of rice, 2 cans of the store's cheapest beans, the labels plain and white, and a bunch of bananas that had a bright yellow sticker on them, marking them down in price because they were starting to show a few brown spots. To her, those spots just meant they were sweet. It was a small victory. But then her heart sank a little. Standing near the checkout were a group of men. They weren't just any men. They were a motorcycle club. They were big, with thick beards and leather vests covered in patches and symbols she didn't understand. Their vests were like a second skin, worn and creased. Their laughter was loud and deep, bouncing off the quiet shelves of the store. It wasn't a mean sound, but it was a powerful one. It was the sound of a world that felt very far from her own. She felt a small, instinctive pull of fear. It was the kind of feeling a small animal gets when a larger one is near. She didn't make eye contact. Instead, she gently maneuvered her daughter to stand on the other side of the cart, using it as a tiny shield. She kept her eyes down, focusing on the items in her cart, hoping they would just finish their business and leave. She started placing her groceries on the conveyor belt. The rice, the beans, the bananas. Each one made a soft thud. The little girl, meanwhile, had spotted something. On a small rack next to the cash register, there were loaves of bread. But this wasn't the plain, sliced bread in a plastic bag. This was the kind that was baked right here in the store. The crust was a perfect golden brown, and it had little seeds sprinkled on top. It sat in a thin, paper bag, and the warm, yeasty smell drifted through the air. The little girl tugged on her mother's coat. "Mommy," she whispered, her voice full of wonder. "Can we get that bread? Smells so good. It smells like Grandma's kitchen used to." The mother's heart squeezed tight in her chest. She could almost taste the memory herself, the warmth of her mother's kitchen, the comfort of a thick, buttery slice. But the memory was a painful luxury. She bent down so her face was close to her daughter's. "Not today, my love," she whispered back, her voice low and soft. She tried to make it sound like it was no big deal. "We have our rice at home. We'll make a nice rice pudding." But the little girl's face fell. Her small shoulders drooped. She didn't understand budgets or bank balances. She only understood that the bread smelled wonderful and her mommy was saying no. A confusion and sadness washed over her. Why couldn't they have it? In her small world, the answer was simple. She didn't yell or cry. She just said it, her small, clear voice cutting through the low hum of the store and the fading laughter of the bikers. It was a simple statement of fact, innocent and sharp as a knife. "My mom can't afford bread." The words hung in the air. For a moment, everything seemed to stop. The mother felt a hot, red wave of shame rush up her neck and flood her cheeks. She couldn't look up. She couldn't meet the eyes of the young cashier, who had suddenly become very interested in scanning a pack of gum. She definitely couldn't look at the group of bikers, whose loud conversation had come to a complete and sudden stop. The silence was worse than the laughter. It was heavy. It felt like everyone was staring at her wobbling cart, at her marked-down bananas. She felt exposed, as if her deepest struggle had been announced over a loudspeaker. She fumbled in her worn purse for her debit card, her fingers trembling, her vision blurred with unshed tears. She just wanted to disappear, to grab her child and her groceries and vanish into the night. "Shoo, baby, it's okay," she murmured to her daughter, her voice cracking slightly. "We're okay. We don't need it." She was trying to comfort her daughter, but the words felt hollow. They were meant for her own ears, a desperate mantra to keep herself from breaking down right there in the Valuemart checkout line. The little girl just looked up at her, confused by the sudden tension and the strange, heavy silence that had swallowed the room. The silence that followed the little girl's words felt thicker than the store's heavy air. The mother kept her eyes locked on the worn leather of her wallet, her fingers nervously tracing its seams. She could feel the weight of attention from the men in leather vests. Her whole body was tense, waiting for a sound. A laugh, a rude comment, the roar of their motorcycles as they finally left. But none of that came. Instead, there was only a low, quiet rumble of a voice. It wasn't loud or angry. It was calm, like distant thunder. "Hey!" The mother flinched, her shoulders tightening. She slowly, reluctantly, lifted her gaze. The man who had spoken was the biggest of the group. He was the one the others seemed to naturally look towards. His beard was thick and dark, and his leather vest, covered in patches, stretched across a broad chest. On the front, the largest patch showed a grizzly bear standing tall. He wasn't looking at her with pity or judgment. He was just looking, his dark eyes moving from her tear-filled eyes to her daughter's confused little face, and then down to the 3 lonely items on the conveyor belt. He took a single, heavy step towards the cashier. The young cashier, a boy probably still in his teens, looked frozen, unsure of what to do. The big man didn't say a word to the mother. He didn't ask any questions. He simply reached into the pocket of his jeans, his fingers pulling out a crumpled bill. It wasn't a 5 or a 10. It was a $100 bill. He placed it on the counter next to the cash register. The paper made a soft, definitive sound against the plastic. "Get the bread, too," he said, his voice still that low, gentle rumble. He nodded towards the golden loaf. "And whatever else the little one needs." For a moment, the mother's mind went completely blank. She couldn't process what was happening. Her eyes darted from the man's serious face to the money on the counter, then back to her daughter. This couldn't be real. Men like this didn't do things like this. They were supposed to be scary. They were supposed to be trouble. This act of pure, simple kindness didn't fit into the world as she understood it. Her mouth felt dry. She finally found her voice, a shaky, fragile whisper. I can't accept that." The words were automatic, born from a lifetime of pride and the fear of being in debt to a stranger. "It's too much. Thank you, but I can't." The big man, the one called Bear by his friends, just shook his head slowly. He didn't smile, but his eyes were soft. "It's already done," he said. There was a finality in his tone that was not harsh, but firm. It was the sound of a decision that could not be undone. He wasn't asking for permission. He was stating a fact. The matter was settled. He turned back to the cashier and gave a short, sharp nod. "Go on." The spell was broken. The cashier, suddenly remembering his job, quickly picked up the $100 bill. He scanned the loaf of bread and carefully placed it in a bag of its own. The mother, still in a daze, watched as he then began to scan her original items again. The rice, the beans, the bananas. The machine beeped cheerfully, a stark contrast to the painful silence from just moments before. She looked at her daughter. The little girl's face had completely transformed. The confusion and sadness were gone, replaced by a wide-eyed wonder. She was staring at the man with the big beard, her little mouth slightly open. She wasn't scared of him at all. To her, he wasn't a scary biker. He was the man who made the magic bread appear. Tears, which the mother had fought so hard to hold back, now escaped. They weren't tears of shame anymore. They were tears of a confusion so deep it hurt. They were tears of a weight being lifted so suddenly that her shoulders felt strangely light. She wiped them away quickly with the back of her hand, but more came. The other men in the group didn't say anything. They just watched. One of them, a thinner man with intelligent eyes and a vest that said Doc on it, gave her a small, almost invisible nod. It was a quiet gesture of reassurance. They weren't putting on a show. They weren't looking for thanks. They were just doing what needed to be done. The cashier finished bagging all the groceries, putting the precious loaf of bread on top. He handed her the bags, now heavy and full, and a thick stack of change. She stared at the money in her hand. It was more cash than she had held in weeks. She turned back to the big man, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you," she managed to say. The words felt completely inadequate for the storm of feelings inside her. He just gave another small nod. "You get your little one home now," he rumbled. She took her daughter's hand, the bags hanging heavy from her other arm. As she walked out of the Value Mart into the cool night air, she felt like she was moving through a dream. The world outside looked the same dark parking lot, the same distant streetlights, but something fundamental had shifted. An act of unexpected kindness had cracked open the hard shell of her hopelessness, and for the first time in a very long time, she felt a tiny, fragile spark of something she had almost forgotten. It felt a little like hope. The cool night air outside the store felt strange on her skin. It was the same air as before, but it felt different to breathe. She held the grocery bags tightly, the paper handle of the one with the bread crinkling in her grip. Her daughter skipped a little beside her, no longer sad but buzzing with a new kind of energy. "Mommy, that big man was nice," the little girl chirped, looking back at the store's automatic doors. "He got us the bread. Are we going to eat it when we get home?" The mother managed a small, wobbly smile. "Yes, baby. We sure are." Her mind was still spinning, trying to catch up with what had just happened. She heard the deep rumble of engines starting up behind her. She expected the sound to grow loud and then fade away as the motorcycle sped off into the night, the strange event finally over. But the sound didn't fade. It settled into a low, steady idle. She glanced over her shoulder. The group of men were mounting their motorcycles, but they weren't leaving. They were just sitting on them, the headlights flicking on, illuminating the parking lot in bright white beams. The big man, the one they called Bear, and the thinner one named Doc were walking towards a beat-up pickup truck parked nearby. At a new, different kind of nervousness began to flutter in her chest. What were they doing? Were they following her? The kindness in the store suddenly felt heavy, complicated. She quickened her pace just a little, heading towards the dark, empty bus stop at the edge of the lot. She heard footsteps behind her, not running, but steady and purposeful. She turned. It was the big man, Bear. He had taken off his sunglasses, and in the dim light, his face looked more tired than scary. "Ma'am," he said, his voice still that low rumble, but softer now away from the noise of the store. "It's a late night. The buses run slow at this hour. Where are you headed?" The question hung in the air. Every instinct told her not to tell a stranger, especially one who looked like him, where she lived. But something in his eyes, the same thing that had been there when he placed the money on the counter, made her feel a flicker of trust. And the thought of waiting alone at a dark bus stop for who knows how long with her tired daughter was suddenly more frightening than this man. She hesitated, then named the apartment complex. It was on the other side of the town, a place people like him usually just rode past. Bear nodded slowly, as if this was exactly what he expected to hear. He gestured with his head towards the idling pickup truck where Doc was now sitting in the driver's seat. "We'll follow you. Make sure you get there all right." It wasn't a suggestion. It was a quiet statement of fact, just like in the store. "It's already done." So she and her daughter sat at the bus stop, the groceries at their feet. A few minutes later, the bus arrived with a sigh of air brakes. As they climbed on and found a seat near the back, she looked out the window. The pickup truck and the line of motorcycles, their headlights like a procession of watchful eyes, pulled out behind the bus. They didn't speed up or pass. They just followed, a silent, rumbling escort through the sleeping town. The bus ride felt surreal. She watched the familiar streets go by, but everything was different seen through this strange new lens. Her daughter, exhausted from the emotion of the evening, leaned against her and fell asleep, her head a warm weight on her arm. When they finally reached their stop, the bus hissed to a halt. She gathered her sleeping daughter in one arm and the heavy grocery bags in the other, struggling to step down onto the sidewalk. The apartment complex stood before them, a cluster of 3-story buildings with peeling paint and broken lights in the parking lot. It looked even more worn out than usual under the pale glow of the single street lamp that was still working. The pickup truck and the motorcycles pulled over and parked. Bear and Doc got out. They didn't say anything. They just walked over. Doc gently took the heaviest grocery bags from her hand. Bear waited, then followed as she led the way to her building. The stairwell smelled of old cigarettes and damp concrete. She lived on the 3rd floor, and the climb was always long, especially with a sleeping child and groceries. Tonight, with these 2 large, quiet men following her, each step felt incredibly strange. She was acutely aware of the chipped paint on the banister, the sticky spot on the 2nd floor landing she always avoided, the faint sound of a television behind one of the doors. She fumbled for her keys at her apartment door, her hands shaking. She pushed the door open into the small, dark space. She hurried in to lay her daughter down on the couch, covering her with a blanket. When she turned back, Bear and Doc were standing just inside the doorway. They placed the grocery bags neatly on the small kitchen counter. They didn't step further in. They didn't snoop or stare, but they saw. How could they not? They saw the single, worn-out armchair. They saw the space heater plugged in next to it, the only source of warmth in the main room. They saw the quiet, careful way she had tried to make the small apartment a home, with a few child's drawings taped to the wall and a thin, clean rug on the floor. They saw the reality of a life lived on the very edge. Bear's eyes scanned the room slowly, then met hers. There was no pity in his gaze. It was more like an understanding, a quiet assessment. He held out the change from the $100 bill. It was still a thick stack of cash. She shook her head, her voice a whisper. "Please, you've done so much already. I can't." He didn't pull his hand back. "For the next time," he said, the same words he'd used in the store. The words held a promise, an acknowledgement that there would be a next time, and that it would be okay. Finally, she took the money, her fingers brushing against his rough, calloused hand. It felt like accepting something more than just dollars and cents. As they turned to leave, Doc, the quieter man, paused. He pulled a small, slightly bent business card from his vest pocket. He placed it on the counter next to the loaf of bread. "It's for the community health center," he said softly. "They see people even if money is tight. They have a sliding scale." He said the last 2 words carefully, as if he'd memorized them for a moment just like this. And then, with a final nod, they were gone. The sound of their boots on the stairs faded, replaced by the rumble of engines starting up once more. This time, the sound did grow distant, until the night was quiet again. She stood alone in her small apartment, the silence ringing in her ears. On the counter sat the golden loaf of bread, the bags of groceries, the stack of cash, and the small white card. They were not just objects. They were proof. Proof that the world was not as cold and hard as it had seemed an hour ago. Someone had seen her struggle, and instead of looking away, they had stepped closer. The quiet in the apartment after the men left felt deeper than before. It was a thoughtful quiet, not an empty one. The mother moved slowly, putting the groceries away. The rice and beans went into the nearly bare cupboard. The bananas were placed in a bowl on the table. But the loaf of bread, she left right out on the counter where she could see it. It was more than just food now. It was a symbol, a strange and beautiful question mark in her life. She sliced 2 thick pieces, the crust cracking perfectly under the knife. The smell that filled the small kitchen was incredible, warm and nutty and full of comfort. She spread a little margarine on the warm slices and woke her daughter gently. The little girl's eyes fluttered open. "Is that the bread, Mommy?" "Yes, it is, sweetheart. Here, try some." They sat together at the small table and ate the bread. It was the best thing either of them had tasted in a very, very long time. It wasn't just about the flavor. It was about the kindness baked into every crumb. For that little while, sitting in the glow of the single kitchen light, the world felt safe and warm. But the story of the little girl and the bread did not end in that apartment. It was just beginning its journey. The next evening, the men of the Ironwood Guardians were gathered in their clubhouse, which was really just a large, cluttered garage behind an auto repair shop. The air smelled of motor oil and old coffee. Tools and motorcycle parts lay on benches. It was their space, a world of their own. The big man, Bear, stood up. The usual easygoing chatter and clinking of beer bottles died down. When Bear stood, everyone listened. He didn't make a big speech. He just told them what he had seen. He talked about the checkout line, the little girl's voice, the mother's shame. He described the 3 items on the conveyor belt. He told them about the apartment, the cold feel of the room, the single-space heater, the quiet struggle that was written on every worn piece of furniture. "You all saw it," he said, his voice low and serious, filling the garage. "That ain't right. A little kid shouldn't have to worry about bread. A mother shouldn't have to feel that kind of shame just for trying to feed her child." He looked around at the faces of his friends, men who had all seen hard times themselves. Some of them had been through divorces, lost jobs, or grown up with nothing. They weren't saints. They were rough men who lived a rough life. But they had a code. Their patch, the grizzly bear, meant they protected their own. And in that moment, that mother and her little girl felt like their own. "We bought her some groceries," Bear continued. "But that's a one-day fix. The problem is still there tomorrow. We're gonna do more." A man with a shaved head and thick, tattooed arms spoke up. "So what's the plan, Bear?" Bear walked over to an old, greasy workbench and picked up an empty glass jar that had once held pickles. He wiped the dust off with his sleeve. He took a $5 bill from his pocket, crumpled it up, and dropped it into the jar. It made a soft clink as it hit the bottom. "This is the plan," he said. That was all it took. One by one, the men got up. They dug into their pockets and their wallets. They didn't donate huge amounts. They put in spare 5s and 10s, a handful of loose change, a 20 from the guy who had just gotten paid. It wasn't about the amount. It was about the action. The jar began to fill not just with money, but with a shared purpose. Their first act wasn't a grand gesture. It was quiet and practical. The thinner man, Doc, found out who owned the apartment complex. He went to the man's office the next day. The landlord was a stern man who was used to dealing with late payments and excuses. Doc didn't ask or plead. He simply said, "I'm here to settle the account for apartment 3B. He paid the mother's back rent in full, in cash, right there on the spot. The landlord was too surprised to say much. The threat of eviction, a dark cloud that had been hanging over the mother for weeks, just vanished. But their help wasn't about throwing money and leaving. The following Saturday, a small group of them rode their motorcycles over to the apartment complex. They didn't come empty-handed. They came with toolboxes, a new lock, and a willingness to work. The mother heard the rumble of the engines and looked out her window, her heart skipping a beat. Were they back? She saw them parking their bikes, looking large and out of place in the rundown parking lot. She went downstairs, her daughter peeking out from behind her legs. Bear saw the question and a little bit of fear in her eyes. "Your front door lock is sticking," he stated, not asking. "We're fixing it. And the kitchen faucet has a drip. It's wasting water, running up your bill." It was true. The drip, drip, drip of that faucet was a sound that kept her awake at night, each drop feeling like a penny lost forever. She was speechless. She just stepped aside. For the next few hours, the men worked. They replaced the broken lock on her front door. They fixed the dripping faucet so it was silent and tight. Then they went down into the building's basement and, with the landlord's reluctant permission, managed to get the old, wheezing furnace to work properly for the first time in years. Warm air began to push through the vents, not just in her apartment, but in all the units. It wasn't just about one family anymore. The tough-looking bikers, with their gruff voices and leather vests, were suddenly a familiar sight. They waved to the elderly man across the hall. They helped a young mother carry a stroller up the steps. The little girl from apartment 3B was no longer hiding behind her mother. She was following Bear around, asking him what every tool was for, her earlier fear completely forgotten. The mother watched it all happen from her doorway. The weight on her shoulders, a weight she had carried for so long she'd forgotten what it felt like to stand up straight, was slowly, gently being lifted. It wasn't just the fixed lock or the warm apartment. It was the feeling that she wasn't alone in her struggle anymore. A wall had been torn down, not with force, but with a simple, quiet act of fixing a dripping faucet. The change in the apartment complex was not something that happened overnight. It was a slow, steady shift, like the first warm days of spring after a long, cold winter. The mother felt it first inside herself. With the fear of eviction gone and a little bit of money in her pocket from the change she'd been given, the constant, tight knot of panic in her stomach began to loosen. She could breathe deeper. She used that breath to make a change. She took the business card for the community health center and called the number. She found out that the man called Doc was right. They did have a sliding scale, and they helped her find a doctor for her daughter. Then, she called the temp agency that was listed on the same card. With a newfound confidence, she was able to secure a better job, one with more hours and a slightly higher pay. It wasn't a fortune, but it was a handhold, a way to start climbing up. The story of the little girl and the bread had lit a fire in the hearts of the Ironwood Guardians. That simple glass jar in their garage became a permanent fixture. They called it the Guardian Fund. It wasn't just for the mother and her little girl anymore. It was for anyone in the neighborhood who was struggling in a way they could understand. They found out which families needed help with an electric bill, which elderly person couldn't afford to fix a leaky roof. Their work became more organized. They started partnering with a local food bank. Every other Saturday, instead of just going for a ride, a line of their motorcycles could be seen pulling small trailers filled with boxes of food. They would deliver them to the apartment complex and other streets where people were having a hard time. The children, who used to hide from the loud bikes, now would run out to greet them, their faces lighting up. The rumble of an engine was no longer a scary sound. It was the sound of help arriving. One sunny Saturday afternoon, the Guardians decided to throw a block party in the apartment complex's parking lot. It wasn't a fancy affair. They brought grills and cooked hot dogs and hamburgers. Someone brought a speaker and played music. The children ran and played games, their laughter mixing with the classic rock tunes. The little girl who had started it all was right in the middle of it all, dancing without a care in the world. The mother stood near the picnic tables, a paper plate with a hot dog in her hand. She watched the scene unfold. She saw the big man, Bear, talking with the elderly man from the first floor. She saw Doc showing a group of kids how his motorcycle engine worked, letting them honk the horn. She saw her neighbors, people who used to pass each other in silence, now talking and laughing together. The community, once just a collection of strangers living in the same rundown buildings, had started to become a real neighborhood. Bear and Doc walked over to her. They each held a bottle of water. "Looks like a good day," Bear said, his voice a low, contented rumble. The mother looked at him, her eyes clear and strong. The weariness that had been etched into her face for so long was gone, replaced by a quiet peace. "It is," she said. "It's a very good day." She paused, looking from Bear's face to Doc's and then back again. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady and sure, "for everything. You didn't just buy us bread. You gave us a chance to breathe again." Bear just nodded, a small, genuine smile visible beneath his thick beard. He didn't need a long speech. Her smile, and the sight of her daughter laughing, was thanks enough. The mother's eyes drifted to the picnic table nearby. Right in the center, next to the bags of chips and bowls of salad, were several loaves of that same golden brown, freshly baked bread. They were there for anyone to take, no questions asked. No shame, no whispers, just good bread for good people. The little girl ran up, her face flushed with happiness. "Mommy, can I have more bread? It's so good." The mother laughed, a real, joyful sound. "Of course you can, baby." As she watched her daughter run back to the table, she understood what had truly changed. The little girl's words in the checkout line had been a single, sad pebble dropped into a still pond. But the conscience of the so-called tough motorcycle gang was the ripple that spread out from it, touching everything in its path. The loudest rumble wasn't from their engines. It was from their hearts, finally stirred to action. They hadn't just changed one life. They had shown an entire community that kindness is a currency anyone can spend, and that sometimes the strongest walls are broken down not by force, but by a simple, shared loaf of bread. Everything had changed, and for the first time in a very long time, the change was beautiful.